So our next segment is going to be on the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act, and it's my pleasure to introduce Aislinn O'Shea, who is the Global Warming Solutions Manager for the Massachusetts Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, where her work really focuses on evaluating the Commonwealth's progress in implementing the Global Warming Solutions Act. She has more than 20 years' experience in the environmental field, working primarily with the public sector on climate change, environmental impact assessment, sustainable development, and natural resource management. And with that, I'd like to ask her to come up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good morning. Oh, so I should speak into this then? Is that okay? Yeah. That work? Okay. Good morning, and it's great to be here. And I'm enjoyed Robert's presentation on the technology. I'm going to focus a bit more on the policy, in particular what we're doing here in Massachusetts. So what is the state of Massachusetts doing as far as climate change mitigation? We are, some of you may be familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was signed into law in 2008. So what I want to do is give you just a brief overview of that, and then I'm going to focus in particular on Massachusetts' Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020. The Global Warming Solutions Act really laid the foundation and set the stage for us to move ahead in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions here in Massachusetts. The legislation itself set a limit of at least an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, pretty ambitious targets, and also by 2020. The legislation required a 10 to 25% reduction, and subsequently it was decided that we would go for the 25%. The legislation also required that the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs coordinate with other agencies and stakeholders to develop a plan for reaching the 2020 goals and subsequent years, and to develop a stakeholder process for both mitigation and for adaptation. So the legislation lays out the plan, some of the components of the plan. It also specifically says that we need to update the plan every 5 years, and we need to do a progress report to evaluate how effective are these policies. The 2020 plan itself identifies 27 key strategies in several different sectors of the economy, which I'll go over shortly. As I mentioned, the legislation requires that we do a 5-year progress report, and that was released recently in December. One of the big things that we've been working on, which I want to talk about, is how are we evaluating our progress? Over the last, since the plan was developed in 2010, there's been a lot of work on the state levels to implement various strategies in energy efficiency, transportation, etc. And over the last couple of years, what we've really been focusing on is implementing the policies, but also trying to figure out how well are we doing? How do we measure and track going forward so that we know if we're on track or not in meeting our goals, and if not, how do we modify and adapt going forward? I'll talk just briefly about adaptation here, and if I have time at the end, I want to give you a little bit more info about what's going on there. The adaptation report was required by the legislation. It was published in 2011, and did a really good overview of what are all the climate change impacts that Massachusetts could be facing in the future: economy, public health, ecological resilience, etc., and laid out some suggestions and recommendations for strategies. More recently, the Governor announced last summer that adaptation was one of the top 3 priorities for EEA to the end of his administration, and also announced an initiative on climate preparedness earlier this year with some funding for infrastructure projects. CZM, Coastal Zone Management, has also been doing a lot of work with communities, with municipalities, with their Storm Smart Coasts program. You can find out more information about that online. So to get back to the actual Global Warming Solutions Act goal of 25% reduction, where are we now? As you can see here, our baseline, our reduction goal is measured against where we were in 1990. That baseline was set, and it's at 94 million metric tons. That's our total greenhouse gas emissions statewide, economy-wide. The latest complete set of data we have is 2011 in terms of a complete, full, approved set of data. Probably an update on 2012 data will be available soon. There's some data, some lag time in getting all the federal and other data sources needed by the end of the year. But as you can see, the latest results show that we're doing pretty well. We're 16% down. We're trying to get to emissions down to 71 million metric tons, a 25% reduction by 2020. And as Robert had mentioned earlier in his presentation, the fuel switching has some impact here. So what we're looking at here is our emissions across the state from all the different sectors. Some of that is influenced by the switch from oil and coal to natural gas. But some of it is also influenced by the policies and programs that we've put in place. As part of our evaluation, there's two ways we measure. How well are we doing, each year when we look at our emissions, but also how well are the specific policies doing, and to what degree are they influencing the change, what's most effective, what isn't. These are the main sections that we're looking at in our 2020 plan. We've got the buildings, energy efficiency, demand-side management, transportation, land use and smart growth. The first four from left to right are the ones where we're tracking all the emissions towards the goals. The cross-cutting policies are very important in terms of supporting our goals as well, but they're captured and counted in the other programs. So in the process of doing our 5-year evaluation, our progress report last year, we really looked at what metrics do we need for all of these to measure all of our strategies. We got a grant from the Barr Foundation actually to develop a database and reporting tool, working with Apt Associates here out of Cambridge. They had developed a similar system for Mexico called Carbon Counts. And we worked with them to reconfigure that for Massachusetts so we could take all of our strategies and the hundreds of metrics that we're using to track our CO2 reductions, and that we can track that going forward, evaluate our progress. And this will be a useful tool not only internally for policy analysis, but also for communicating with the public, for transparency. We are trying to be as transparent as possible. Some of the graphs, the graphic I showed you earlier is from our Global Warming Solutions website, where we're uploading information, data that we're getting from our tracking system. So as part of this evaluation, we basically looked at each of the sectors and said, okay, where do we think we are now? What data do we actually have? In the green is data that we have actually verified, validated, that's in our performance management system. And then in the blue, this represents, the percentage. So in buildings, 9.8%, almost 10% of the overall of the 25% we're trying to get is coming from this sector, so it's pretty huge. We looked at it, we decided we're pretty likely, based on all of our data, qualitative, quantitative, and talking with all the experts who are involved, we're pretty likely to get to almost 2/3 of that. And with additional emphasis and supplemental strategies and more investment and new measures, we can get to our goal. So overall, if you look over here, of the 25%, we're pretty likely to get to 18% based on what we're doing now. We really need to focus more on the transportation sector, as you can see. Making shifts in the transportation, smart growth, land use patterns, et cetera, it's more difficult to implement and it's more difficult to track. I won't have time to go into all of the strategies in detail, but I wanted to just give you an overview. So in those sectors, what are the kinds of things that we're working on? So in the building sector, as you can see here, we've got 5 major strategies that we're working on. The biggest one is the all cost-effective energy efficiency. Some of you may have heard of the Mass Save program, where you can get an audit for your home, and there are incentives available to do a building envelope, energy efficiency measures, insulation, et cetera. That is the big piece of the all cost-effective energy efficiency strategy, which is managed by the utility, the energy providers, and it's funded by the auction of carbon through the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And this is the biggest. This has been going very well. Our evaluation shows that we're pretty much on track on this strategy. Some of the others we don't have so much data yet. There's work going on. They're being implemented. Tree planting, for example, to reduce heating and cooling loads. There was a $5 million investment recently for gateway cities to increase canopy in those areas. Great potential there for reducing energy use. Some slowdown in the federal standards that will be delayed. So we're looking at ways that we can bump up all of these where some of the strategies are not moving as quickly as others. Energy generation and distribution. So this is, almost 30% of the reductions we're looking for by 2020 is coming from energy generation and distribution. And a big piece of this is the renewables. Clean energy imports. There's now you may have heard there's been a regional agreement on coordinated procurement of renewable energies. There's also a bill pending right now, a clean energy resources bill, that will really help support the market for renewables. As Robert alluded to earlier, the switching from coal and oil to natural gas, the EPA power plant rules. We were expecting to get a couple of % reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions basically because of these, because coal plants were going to close down, and that's happening. So we are seeing a switch to natural gas and some reduced emissions here. Transportation, smart growth and land use. As I mentioned, this one is harder to implement, but there's a lot of good stuff happening here. We work very closely with the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. They have a Green Dot program, so they're working both internally on their own operations and fuel switching, electric vehicles, etc., as well as looking at the broader picture of public transit and how do we get people out of their cars, how do we get more biking and walking. The Office of Housing and Economic Development also working with us on joint strategies to try and make sure that we can get houses, jobs, in walkable communities near public transit. So the non-energy emissions one, this relates mainly to those substances that have a high global warming potential. Some hundreds or thousands times more potent than carbon dioxide. So while this is a small sliver maybe of our overall strategy, it's 2%, I think, of the reductions, 1.65 million metric tons. It is very important to focus on, and this is on track. These strategies are going well. DEP has draft regulations underway for SF6 emission reductions and also for the refrigerants. And they've been doing a lot of work with municipalities, technical assistance for getting plastics out of the waste stream, getting them out of landfills to avoid incineration and the associated emissions. So the fifth sector that I was pointing out earlier is the cross-cutting emissions policies. So these are things like leading by example. It's a state program at state facilities to enhance energy efficiency and use of renewables. We are seeing some good reductions here, as you can see, from 2008 to 2012. We've also seen some reductions from MEPA projects, commitments made through MEPA. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act reviews development projects, public and private, go through review if they trip certain thresholds, and they're required to do an analysis of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings and transportation and to commit to certain mitigation. So we're tracking these going forward, and like I said, this and the leading by example, and also the green communities. We have 123 green communities in Massachusetts, and they commit to various measures to go beyond code to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency, and other ways to reduce carbon footprint. So these programs, while we don't have specific targets for them, we're tracking them and we're seeing how they're contributing to the overall goal. So where are we now in terms of renewables? Our goal for 2020 for wind energy is 2,000 megawatts of wind installed by 2020, and we're at about 103 megawatts now. The solar goal originally was 250 megawatts, and we surpassed that a couple of years ago, I believe, and it's now been increased to 1,600 megawatts, and we're at over 500 megawatts installed now. There's some new regulations that came out recently on solar that's going to help support the market to get to this 1,600 megawatts. Oh, and I didn't mention combined heat and power, other way of using waste heat, et cetera, and more efficient operations, so less fuel is needed. We have about 330 megawatts installed across the state right now. So just to wrap up on the mitigation piece, I wanted to just highlight some of the things that are new. I mentioned the solar regs. Also just some things that are pending with the legislation right now that you might be interested in keeping an eye on, or just to be aware that these are coming. There is a pending thermal energy bill, which will be really important in helping to move the renewable thermal forward. In one of the pie charts earlier, I didn't put out, but as part of the energy generation, one of our goals was to develop a market for solar. And that was a little sliver of that pie chart, a 0.1%, 0.1 million metric tons or something like that. But as Department of Energy Resources and others have been doing more research and evaluation of the potential for renewable thermal for both heating and cooling, we've realized that this is like a big opportunity and has the potential to get us not just the 0.1 we had for solar, but looking at all renewables for thermal has the potential to get us, another 2%, 2 million metric tons reduction of the 23 we're looking for. So that is, those regulations are pending right now. The other one I wanted to highlight, the zoning reform bill is a particularly important one for smart growth. If we really want to move towards more sustainable development, more transit-oriented, livable, workable communities, I think this is an important, the zoning hasn't been changed for 40 years, so this could be really helpful in moving us towards those targets in the transportation sector. I mentioned earlier that we are required to update the plan every 5 years. By the end of next year, we need to update the 2020 plan. And as we've been going through this evaluation process, looking at, okay, how are we doing? We've also realized where we may need to change how we measure things or how we implement, et cetera. So that'll be a big focus for our team over the next year. And we'll be working with stakeholders and other agencies on thinking beyond 2020 to 2050, because there's a lot of things that we could be doing now, a lot of things we are doing and things we could be doing more of that will be important to keep us on track to that 80% reduction goal. So as I've been talking mostly about mitigation, and I know there's a lot of other topics, resiliency topics at this conference. I wanted to highlight some of the things that the state is doing as well. I mentioned Governor Patrick's initiative earlier. There's been recently $50 million made available for priority infrastructure projects. And also a request for $2 million in next year's budget for strengthening public resources, for example, the vulnerability of the transportation infrastructure. So Coastal Zone Management has recently awarded some grants over $2 million to local communities for projects for green infrastructure projects, projects to address coastal storms and flooding, et cetera. There was $10 million overall for this group, the coastal infrastructure, and a big piece of that, $7.6 million, was also for to repair declining seawalls. On the energy side of things, of that $50 million, 40 of it has been allocated to clean energy resilience programs, which will benefit local communities. The Department of Environmental Resources, of Energy Resources, DOER, is managing this. So that for communities who are interested in this, the applications, it's actually open now for applications. So if anyone is interested in getting more information, get on Department of Energy Resources, DOER's website. There are both technical support grants available and also project implementation grants available. And the deadline for those is, application is July 15th. So that is what I had to share with you today, and I'm happy to take any questions either now or later as part of the panel.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Okay, maybe I talk too fast. Sorry.
No, I think it's about on time. Maybe
Okay.
fine.
Yes, you had a question?
Could you elaborate a little bit on the plan for expanding combined heat and power?
That I am not familiar in detail with that, so I'm aware that it's going on, but I don't know of all the details in that. But I'd be happy to, give you my card later and point you in the right direction with someone at DOER who could answer that for you. Yeah, we have another question up there.
Yeah, I was wondering where Canadian hydropower fits into the picture and how reliant we are on that to meet development.
Yes, the Canadian hydropower, the clean energy, which is called the clean energy imports, and has now been broadened somewhat to clean energy resources. It may come from other sources with this new bill that's coming in, but that is actually a big piece of the plan. So for the energy, it's like 5% in the 2020 plan. That of that 25% reduction, 5% of it is geared towards coming from the Canadian hydropower. Now, it may be that we get less from there and we get more from renewable resources from other areas. That still remains to be seen. Any other questions?
Yeah, back here.
I couldn't see.
Yeah, here,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry, okay.
The panelists yesterday made pretty clear that existing buildings in the waterfront areas, as in Boston and other coastal communities, are the buildings and the areas that are most vulnerable to sea level rise and other climate impacts, and they should be the focus of a lot of efforts to retrofit them and prepare them better for flooding and so on. One of your earlier slides showed that I think you get the biggest bang for buck also by focusing on retrofitting existing buildings to make them more energy efficient.
Yeah.
Is there a way to combine those two needs and kill two birds with one stone? Provide retrofit packages that make buildings both more energy efficient and more resilient?
That's a really good point, actually. The strategy as it is now has been more focused on the energy efficiency side of things as opposed to the resilience. However, I envision that through this new the new funds that have become available and the coastal resilience, the DOER and the CCM programs, that may be something. But that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of looking at how that can be done in combination as opposed to silo. There may be opportunity for integration. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.